This week he launched an alternative budget for Brexit and advised the Chancellor to be less gloomy about the consequences of leaving the EU. Thank you for joining us this morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Your alternative budget is pretty radical, to put it mildly. You want to almost halve corporation tax, cap stamp duty to help the London market, suspend the non-dom tax. It sounds like you're pretty much advocating the opposite of what we're likely to hear from your Conservative Chancellor on Wednesday.
Well, there are two parts to the proposals I suggested. One is that we should show that after we've left the European Union, the UK is open to the rest of the world, that it's not about closing off to Europe, it's by opening up to the rest of the world. And the second is to look at the modelling that has been done by the Treasury and some other forecasters, which has been so comprehensively wrong that the forecasts made before Brexit about what would happen purely on a vote to leave have turned out to be not only false, but hopelessly false. And Patrick Minford, with his team at Cardiff University, has done some modelling based on classical economic principles and what happens if you move to free trade that would be very, very positive for the economy.
Well, you're predicting from that a Brexit dividend of £135 billion, which sounds fantastic. But why are you right about that and everybody else, including the Bank of England, the Office for Budget Responsibility, even the Institute for Fiscal Studies, why have they got it all wrong?
Well, it depends on the type of modelling you do. That the modelling that's been done on the effects of our leaving by the Treasury have been based on gravity models, and these work on the basis of the nearness of the market and the size of the economy you're trading with. But these have been hopelessly wrong in the past. They predicted that if we joined the euro, for example, trade would grow by 300%. These were then revised down to 200%, but that's fantasy land. The modelling I'm working off is done by Professor Patrick Minford, who has an extraordinarily good track record of getting these big issues right. He was one of the economists who disagreed with the 364 economists who wrote to the Times in 1981. He was right about the exchange rate mechanism. He was right about the euro.
But being right in the past doesn't mean you're right in the future, of course. Why do you think, if this is so obvious to you, the Treasury don't pick up the same numbers?
Well, I think the Treasury was rather humiliated by the errors in its forecasts prior to Brexit and is trying to defend its position that the short-term economic consequences of a vote to leave was one of the most dishonest documents to come out of the Treasury. It was purely a piece of political propaganda, and I think they're understandably wounded by that and are sticking to the same script rather than looking at other forecasts and seeing what other experts are saying.
So on that, you've said before that you think the Governor of the Bank of England is an enemy of Brexit, and it sounds as though you think the Treasury are opposed to it as well. Is the Chancellor, has he fallen under their spell and been persuaded to be an enemy of Brexit?
No, I don't think he is. I have a great deal of admiration for the Chancellor, but his predecessor, George Osborne, was the architect of Project Fear and was much too close to the Governor of the Bank of England, who lost his independence by cozying up to the government prior to the Brexit vote. And that's what needs to change, and it's an opportunity in the budget for Philip Hammond to show that he is putting aside the Treasury's mistakes of the past. And it's very encouraging what he's saying this morning about a more positive approach to Brexit. I think that's extremely welcome.
I mean, Lord Lawson, also a former Chancellor, of course, has accused Philip Hammond of being very close to sabotage on Brexit. Nadine Dorris says we need a can-do man at the Treasury, not a prophet of doom. Do you think that's what he's been until now?
No, I don't. I think that Philip Hammond is an exceptionally intelligent man, a very thoughtful man, and I think it's not altogether a bad thing to have a Chancellor who is serious-minded and steady, rather than one who is a showman and uses the exchequer to interfere in absolutely everything. So no, I've got a great deal of confidence in the Chancellor.
Now, when you launched your budget for Brexit, you said that the government has to deliver the £350 million a week for the NHS that was promised during the EU referendum. Even though you didn't think that promise should be made, it's something they now need to deliver on?
Yes, I think it is. And this only comes once we've left. We can't do it before we've got the money from leaving. I think politicians have to recognise that voters don't look at the small print of electoral promises. That if you put 350 million on the side of a bus and say this may be available for the NHS, people don't notice the may, and nor should they actually. It's perfectly reasonable to think that that is a promise. Brexit was won by the Leave campaign, and therefore I think it is very important that that promise is delivered upon. politicians must keep faith with voters and deliver on implied promises as well as ones that are set out in every last detail.
So the Cabinet will move on to talking about the Brexit bill this week, and of course we understand that they may need to come up with more money to satisfy EU demands. Of course, the more money that is spent on that is less money that is then available for things like spending on the NHS. Are you worried about the size of the exit bill?
Well, you put your finger on the most important point, that it is a matter of choice for the government. They will have to choose whether to give lots of money to the European Union or to spend money on necessary UK public services. And that will be part of the negotiation. In all these expenditure issues, and indeed tax issues, it comes down to choices that government makes. I would encourage the government to make the choice of our own domestic public services rather than expensive schemes in continental Europe.
Why then are you advocating that the government should spend much more money, up to £2.5 billion, on preparing for a no-deal scenario when that's money that could be spent on essential public services?
Well, I don't think all of that would need to be spent, but I think it is really important that we are ready to leave in the event of no deal. That if we left with no deal, we would, on current figures, if it cost the full £2.5 billion, still be saving the remains of the 18 billion, so we'd be saving 15.5 billion against paying for the rest of the multi-annual financial framework. So to show that we're ready on day one would be money well spent, and most of it will be needed anyway. We need to have new customs arrangements in place for when we finally left the European Union, even if it's not for a no-deal situation.
There are some suggestions this week that the government might back down on the idea of putting the time and date of leaving the European Union on the face of the bill. Would you be concerned if that was removed from the bill?
Well, it's in Article 50 that unless Article 50 is extended by unanimity in the Council of Europe, we leave on the 29th of March 2019. We are no longer a signatory to the treaties, and it makes sense that that should be the same in domestic law, but whether it's introduced by a statutory instrument or is on the face of the bill is a secondary concern from my point of view. It's important that we leave on that date.
Okay, Jacob Rees-Mogg, stay there if you would. We're joined in the studio now by the former Minister Stephen Hammond, who is a member of the Treasury Select Committee and one of the Tory MPs who was named as a Brexit mutineer by the Daily Telegraph this week. Lucky him. I'm also assured that you are no relation to the Chancellor, despite sharing a surname with him, Mr. Hammond. I mean, let's just pick up on what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying there. How important is it to you as a mutineer, as the Telegraph put it, that the government do not put on the face of the withdrawal bill the date and time of our leaving? Why does it matter?
Well, I agree with Jacob that, of course, it is in the with Article 50 process. But the key reason it's important is that these negotiations look like they're going to be tricky. They look like they're going to be longer than we expected. And it may well be that we are still negotiating out right up until March 2019. With unanimity, we could then have a very short, maybe couple of weeks period of extension. Why would you do harm to the British economy by falling out on a precise time if those negotiations need to be extended? They won't go on for many more than a couple of weeks because there's going to be elections in Europe in June 2019. There's no chance of a new Commission or a new Parliament dealing with this. And so I think giving itself flexibility. And the other key point is flexibility. The government has said all the way along it wants flexibility in negotiations. Why hamstring yourself and give all the advantage to the other side? And part of that was evidenced yesterday by someone trying to suggest that they're going to ask for the Thatcher rebate to be suspended. And that is a direct result of putting this date on the face of the bill.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, you did not agree with the Brexit Committee on which you sit's findings on this. You think it is important that we set the date and time?
I think it's perfectly reasonable to set the date and time, and I think that these negotiations fill the time available. That the United States and Australia agreed a free trade deal between April 2003 and February 2004. These things don't need to be interminable if both sides want to agree, and I think deadlines focus the mind. I think the British electorate would be very concerned if nearly 3 years after the vote to leave, we still hadn't left. I think most people expected that we would have left by now. And the negotiations, realistically, to get through the approval of the European Parliament and so on, need to be completed by the end of next year. Going up to the last minute, I don't think is realistic in these circumstances.
Of course, in order to move on to talking about a trade deal and getting that done, the EU need to agree to move on, and to do that, of course, we need to settle the divorce. Cabinet are going to be talking this week about the amount of money that needs to be spent on that. Stephen Hammond, are you happy for the government to offer significantly more than the 20 billion euros that was suggested in Theresa May's Florence speech?
Well, I hope that the government will stick to the Florence speech in terms of ensuring that we fulfil all our liabilities and obligations, which we've said we'll do. I am not clear exactly what that, whether that's 20 billion or 40 billion. I'm not sure the government is at the moment. The other key thing is that if part of the divorce bill is then some settlement for getting the trade deal, then we'll need to examine that very carefully.
So, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is this something else that might spark another war within the party if the Cabinet do start to suggest they're prepared to pay significantly more than Theresa May indicated in Florence?
I think we need to go back to what you said first of all, that the EU is saying they want us to settle the money first. That is their negotiating position. That is not holy writ. The government doesn't have to follow that, and they need our money. If we don't pay any money for the final 21 months of the multi-annual financial framework, the EU has about £20 billion, 18 to 20 billion pounds gap in its finances. It has no legal authority to borrow, and that means either it's insolvent or the Germans and others have to pay more, or possibly some receive less. So our negotiating position on money is very strong, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking just because Monsieur Barnier has said it, it is as if he has received tablets of stone like Moses. He hasn't.
Stephen Hammond, I mean, there is a sense that the government feels that a more generous offer here, or certainly some people are advising them of this, would set a good tone for going ahead into the trade talks. The kind of approach that Jacob Rees-Mogg is advocating there would not necessarily make for smooth relations going forward.
Well, it probably wouldn't, but I mean, I think where we'd have to be clear is what we're paying for and what we're getting. No one is suggesting that we should just hand over money without any proper scrutiny. That would be entirely inappropriate. But it may well be entirely appropriate to put money to facilitate international trade, which will secure jobs in this country. And I think we need to be quite careful about some of the analysis going around about what the scale and size of the Brexit dividend is and what the scale and size of payments are going to be. One must never confuse gross and net. And there is obviously considerable disagreement amongst the economics profession about some of the numbers that are being floated around.
So on that, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg in his budget for Brexit is suggesting in 5 years' time we could have a £135 billion Brexit bonus. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I think Jacob is using some analysis. I looked into that analysis this week. Seems to me it has four fundamental flaws. Firstly, it's predicting a price drop in the United Kingdom of 10%. Tariff drops will only be 3 or 4%, where's the rest coming from? Secondly, it's predicting huge productivity gains across the economy, the like of which we've not seen in 20 years. Thirdly, I think it's, despite Jacob's view on gravity models, there's clear evidence in a lot of analysis they work. And more importantly, actually, if you go into the details of Professor Minford's analysis, some of the data he's using is 14 years out of date.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, we'll let you come back on that. You're being hopelessly optimistic.
I don't think that's right. I think the fall in prices comes because you make the economy so much more competitive that you take away tariffs, which reduces the price of food potentially by 20%. That's a big reduction. Bear in mind that the biggest tariffs hit food, clothing and footwear, which harm the poorest in society the most, and that the gains from productivity come from this additional tariffs hit disposable income for people, leading to other consumption or saving and further investment. So I think the modelling done by Professor Minford is as good as modelling can ever be. That doesn't mean it's infallible.
Okay. Now,
and the failure of gravity models is well known.
You'll know that Michael Gove was accused this week of auditioning for the job of Chancellor by using long economic-y words in cabinet discussions. Do you know any good long economic-y words?
I don't think that we want to get into this type of business, actually. I think all Conservatives, and Stephen and I very much agree on this, want to show as united a front as we can possibly manage. There are differences on some aspects of policy, but in terms of individuals, we want to stand together and support the best interests of the government.
All right, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Stephen Hammond, thank you.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.